But coming on next to you, Tessa, I think the idea of lobbying can be incredibly scary. And I think it's something that a lot of people feel is not something that an individual can get involved in, really, that it's for big organizations, and leaders rather than little old me and my company. What would you say to individuals, to employers and also employees about how they can get involved in this lobbying discussion?
Yeah, I think before the final answer, maybe just also talking about this concept of employee activism, maybe harking also back to me as a social entrepreneur. 10, 15 years ago, individuals started businesses from this idea of they were surprised and flabbergasted around why businesses run the way they do, and they started setting up purpose-driven businesses. And I think that we can learn a lot from the way that businesses have been set up as, based in inquiry and role modeling what a business can be like. And they've really were set up to disrupt industries from the inside out. And I think that that's what a lot of big businesses have had over the past 10, 15 years, is there's been a lot of disruption from social entrepreneurs, from media, from legislation. And I think that the one thing that is, has been missing a little bit is that disruption from the inside out. And that's what's happening, I think, as the population or the demographics within businesses change. We have a lot of people who've grown up with climate anxiety, who come into their businesses, and we might think that, employee activism isn't real, but if you look at some of the statistics, there have been a lot of studies over the past couple of years. One of them is the Employee Barometer by Paul Polman, the former boss of Unilever, who says of the 3,000 employees they interviewed in the UK and in the US, 50% is actually willing to give up their job if their values don't align with the company values, and 33% of employees already have. And there's a bigger study from Deloitte for Gen Z and millennials saying that 50% is actually willing to drive environmental change, but that 15% only feels that they know how to influence their organizations. So it's a real thing, and I think that what we're trying to say is, rather than quit, act. And how can you act? And as an employee, it's not always easy because you're obviously dependent on your employer. So activism isn't always about being the one who speaks up and who is in the limelight. When it comes to activism, there's a lot of different things that you can do. And when it comes to lobbying in particular, I think that there's a lot of fact-finding that needs to happen, that there's a lot of sabotage, I wanted to say, from big companies, intentionally or unintentionally, around that they might be giving money to lobby for anti-climate legislation, even though on the front-facing they're saying that they're doing a lot of different things. But it can be also different things. How is your pension being spent? Are you a member of trade associations that might be lobbying for something different than you are lobbying with? So I think that the first thing that employees really need to do is to go on that fact-finding mission. And then it's a matter of saying, how can we organize and start influencing in companies through collective action? And I wouldn't be a social entrepreneur if I left it at that. I think then there's also this matter of you're not just against something, you're also for something. So how can we look at what are the innovations or the pathways that we can take inside companies and role model that?
Yeah, great, thank you.
Could I just come in? I think if people, particularly small businesses, did lobby, for instance, their members of parliament would be pleasantly surprised, because in my 20 years as an MP, one thing that always struck me was how charities, individuals, schools would come and lobby me as a member of parliament, but small businesses in particular never did it. So they never came to me. The organisations that did come to me and to other members of parliament were the big organisations like the CBI. They would have a very effective, large lobbying sort of activity, but small businesses never saw a role for their member of parliament in terms of advocating for them. So I would certainly recommend it, and you might actually get quite a positive response from your member of parliament.
Yeah. Maybe feeding into that is that having been in a small business, it's not a budget that a small business has, it's a lobbying budget. But I think what is happening a lot, and I spoke that about Adam Garfield about the B Corp, for example, it's now part of the assessment to build coalitions and to maybe come together and to lobby. So then as a small business, that it's important, if you don't have that budget, to find members or people in other associations you're a part of and lobby together.
Yeah, absolutely. And at this point, I have to give a name check to Business
Sorry.
Declares, because I can see Ben sitting at the front there. And Element 4 is a part of Business Declares, and I highly recommend that you get involved. You know, it's a way of scaling action. And I think, you know, let's talk practically now, you know, really, really practically. Carla, you've mentioned a few acronyms there, like APPGs and things like this. I think, Tom, if I come to you first, how do these polluters operate? What are the avenues that you can use to get in front of power and influence? So,
well, one thing that we haven't talked about yet is the role of party manifestos. Now, that's quite hard for organisations to get involved with, but we have spent probably the best part of the last year, 18 months, working with other organisations, have an impact on a process called the National Policy Forum, which is the Labour Party's internal process for developing their policies, because one of the most effective ways of getting something that you want done is embedding it in a manifesto, assuming that party then gets elected to power. Because if it's in the manifesto, it isn't necessarily going to get delivered, but there's a reasonable chance that it will. If it's further down the line, when perhaps a draft bill is being produced, then yes, there are going to be opportunities, and it's worth bearing in mind that it's the minister and the people around him or her will be the people who are deciding who they are going to receive and be lobbied by. And nobody should hold back from approaching said minister and saying, I want you to listen to me, and certainly don't wait for the approach, because it may never come.
yeah.
If I look back at the lobbying bill, and people can go and look at the quarterly register of meetings that I had as a minister, you will see that I probably met about 30 different civil society organisations during that period. Now, they would probably say, great, you did, but you didn't actually do anything in response to our approach. I'd argue that maybe we did make some tweaks here and there. So I think people need to be proactive at the right points in trying to engage in the processes that are underway.
Yeah. And Sophie, for you, could you give some practical tips for people who have no idea, have never really engaged in lobbying before, about how they can get access into some of these forums in a way which doesn't require millions of pounds of budget and a whole lobbying team?
Yeah. Before that, I just want to quickly just jump on what you just said in terms of making things really easy for MPs. So in the past as well, in different organisations I've worked in, I mean, actually going with potential drafts of legislation and things like that, so that an MP or an MEP, whatever level or a councillor you're kind of lobbying at, can basically look at something that they might not understand, right? I mean, working in the tech space, AI is a big thing right now. Very few people really understand how to regulate AI. For those who know, like, it really helps to go with something to the policymakers and be like, this is how it works, and this would be a potential kind of, you know, legislation, etc., that would be useful for regulating it. So I think that's, you know, one of the things you can do. In terms of the kind of accessing that space, anyway, I would also say, Stop Ecocide has done a very good job at that as well in terms of creating a definition around that, right, which you know, world leaders can take and adopt into their own legal frameworks if they're so minded. But in terms of how everyday people can get involved, I think, you know, that's a kind of more internal exercise, right? What's authentic to you? What do you really care about, right? And it might not be what your company or organization is actually doing. And I think that goes back into the kind of 80-20% rule as well. So something that for you, if you really care about it, I think, you know, you can get involved in a number of different communities. And I think what Ben's doing with Business Declares is fantastic. And it makes you feel like you're part of a community of like-minded organizations. And it's not always easy to get your organization to sign up to those things as well, and that's fine if they don't. But if you're part of the community, then you'll start to hear about different initiatives different letters you can sign, different events you can go to, etc., and feel like you're part of a forward progress, which is really, really important.
Yeah.
So yeah, starting at kind of your own internal kind of process, I think is probably a good place to begin.
Yeah, brilliant. I'm conscious that we could run an entire day on this topic, and probably a day with each of you. I'm conscious of time. Could you just tell me how long we've got? Because I'd like to go to the floor for questions.
10 minutes.
15 minutes, good. Well, we'll just finish a few more questions here, and then we'll come to the floor for questions. Could I just have a look at the results of that Slido poll?
Wow.
Look at that. So 56, more than half of you have never been involved in lobbying, and almost 10% don't know if they have. Well, quite simply, taking what Tom said, if you've ever written to your MP, then frankly, you are a lobbyist. So that's how to get started. And actually, that's how I started with my work on waste incineration, was I went and met with my MP. It was not something I'd ever done before. And now I'm a serial MP botherer. It's kind of become my passion and my hobby, so I can highly recommend it if you're a geek like me, obviously. Carla, I can't let you go without talking about this experience at CBI. Can you tell us about your experience of where you wish that you'd had more support?
Yes, so I made a case to you a few minutes ago about getting involved in the mainstream business organisations. So that could be the CBI, the Confederation of British Industry, Chambers of Commerce, locally or nationally, Federation of Small Business, Make UK, Build UK, whichever is the relevant one or ones for you. And I'll give you an example for why. The budget that came out this spring from the government, in the run-up to that, the CBI lobbied the government to extend the tax incentive for businesses to invest in machinery and hardware. Now, the Green Party was lobbying for something similar, but specifically that it would be a tax incentive for those who invested in machinery and hardware that helps to green their business. Makes sense, right? Nudging businesses in the right direction. Now, because the CBI is very large and influential, they got pretty much exactly what they wanted from government. So they got government to extend what's called the super deduction to 2026 and made noises about a view to making it permanent. And I think that if more green and ethical businesses had been part of the CBI, then the CBI might have been lobbying for something closer to what the Green Party were lobbying for, and then we might now have a government policy in place that was more proactively nudging businesses towards doing the right thing.
Yeah. And I think that's really, it's very, very interesting there, isn't it? Because I see a lot of organisations corporately are members of different associations, whether that's a trade body, whether it's a professional institute, for whatever profession you're in. And I often ask the companies that I work with, what is this trade body's position on climate or on this particular policy? And although that company is paying a subscription fee to that organisation, most of the time they have no idea what that trade body is lobbying for within the halls of power. And so I think that's a really powerful way to use the money that you're spending and the influence that you have within your sector.
And obviously I understand, especially with the CBI, having been in the news over the last few months, that the idea of joining them might leave a bad taste in the mouth, and maybe that's not the particular organisation to join. Maybe a better one suits you and your business. I'm not here to tell you that. But I do think that the general case is that it's worth being part of these organisations to help push things in the right direction. I mentioned engaging in all-party parliamentary groups. That's APPGs that were mentioned before. There is an APPG on almost everything, and they are the secretariat for those APPGs is often provided by an organisation, whether it's a trade body or an NGO campaigning in that space, or a think tank or whatever. So you might consider your business or your trade body volunteering to be the secretariat for that all-party parliamentary group, and then that does what Sophie, or can mean that you can do what Sophie was describing about providing politicians with an example of what you want to see. And I would say that in my experience since 2015 as a city councillor in Bristol, it's not that, or I hope, maybe some will, most politicians won't take what you've sent them and just submit it without even reading it. But if it's on a specialist technical area, or just because politicians have always got 10 times more that they could be doing than there are enough hours in the day to do, having, and especially if you're an ethical business and you're lobbying a politician that you know to be progressive, and you know that you already agree on the principle of something, providing them with chapter and verse on what it is exactly that you want to see is helpful and means that it's more likely to be adopted. I want to squeeze in one final plug before I hand back, which is about the Better Business Act. So the Better Business Act is a campaign to make a small tweak to the Companies Act, which would require all businesses to have a triple bottom line, basically. It's a business-led campaign. It's already got over 2,000 businesses signed up. And so I think that's a really tangible thing that companies can do to push that lobbying effort. And again, it's something that we as politicians can support, but needs to be led by business itself.
Can I just underline something that Carla said? And don't underestimate how under-resourced most members of parliament are. And so there'll be an awful lot of expertise in this room with people who are far more expert in those areas than the member of parliament, who will sometimes literally read out the briefing that has been sent to them. So it's very definitely worth providing information, if you've got it, that is relevant to your company or to your line of business, because very often the Member of Parliament is not going to have access to that information themselves.
Absolutely. I found myself quoted in Hansard, actually, because I wrote a briefing for an MP on waste incineration, and they read it out, not quite verbatim, but almost. And I was like, oh, I wrote that. You know, it was so exciting to actually see that an individual can have influence, you know, and that is something that I think is a power that we all have. We're all, as Tom says, expert in our sectors and have the ability to inform policymakers about what is the right thing to do.